Welcome to Targeted, True Crime, Domestic Violence. We tell stories of women, men, and children who were targeted by domestic abuse. We investigate cases of family violence each season using academic research to help us interpret the events. This podcast discusses very sensitive information about abuse and violence. Although I strive for respect and balance, some details may be graphic and listener discretion is advised. I'm Mo Blackwell, the host of Targeted. I created the Targeted podcast because I'm a college professor and I think we need to stop making family violence a secret. It's time for us to tell our stories, reclaim our power, use our experiences to help, to heal, and to provoke change. Together, we can do it. In June of 1985, Tracey Thurman sued the City of Torrington and its police officers for $3.5 million. During the trial, her lawyer, Burton Weinstein, said, quote, "Whatever happens, happens, but it was worth doing even if we lose the case. The City of Torrington will have to be more careful next time," unquote. As we discussed last week, there was some controversy over whether or not Tracey Thurman could even file this suit against the city for violating her 14th Amendment rights, but a federal judge ruled that she could. It was the first time that this type of lawsuit was permitted in the United States. The case was heard at the U.S. District Court in Hartford, Connecticut, by a 6-person jury under the direction of Judge Blumenfeld. The reason it was the first case of its kind was because it was the first time a federal judge had allowed a woman to sue the police for not protecting her from a known abusive husband. The city was represented by defense lawyer James Cohn. Since the lawsuit included 24 individual police officers, the men retained a separate attorney named Jesse Frankel to defend them. Evidently, the police officers had to have their assets held in an escrow account because they might be obligated to turn over their personal assets, such as their houses or their bank accounts, if they lost the case and if it was determined that they were personally at fault. The trial opened with Tracey telling her story. Although Tracey arrived in a wheelchair, she left it in the back of the courtroom as she slowly shuffled to the witness stand, wearing heavy boots that helped support her paralyzed limbs. Tracey's story was calmly told, focusing on details and leaving out much of the emotion. When it came time to cross-examine her, the police officer's lawyer, Frankel, attacked Tracey's credibility, something that did not end up going over well with the jury. He questioned her sharply about how much she remembered of the assault and how she knew that the police officer had witnessed the assault. Tracey admitted that she was not conscious for all of the attack, something that Frankel thought was an important admission, but the information only served to further solidify the brutality of the attack. Frankel also pressed Tracey how she knew the police were there, to which she replied that she had seen the officer's feet. She further testified that she had seen the officer drive up to the house before the attack, when she was talking to Buck, and she saw the door of the police car open. It was after that, when Buck took out a knife, that Tracey ran away. Because Buck was in between her and the police officer, she was forced to run away from the officer. Tracey drifted in and out of consciousness, but she was confident that she had heard the officer tell Buck to give him the knife 3 different times. Tracey also testified that she could see the police officer's feet when Buck kicked her in the head. Although Frankel closely questioned Tracey as to whether or not those feet could have belonged to someone else, such as a neighbor, Tracey firmly denied the possibility. The next witness was Officer Petrovitz, and he disagreed with much of Tracey's testimony that day, but there were some interesting revelations. When Tracey called the police for immediate protection because Buck was threatening her outside the apartment, the dispatch had ordered Officer Petrovitz, who was in his patrol car, to go and arrest Buck. Petrovitz decided it wasn't an urgent matter because he first returned to the police station and took a bathroom break before proceeding to Tracey's apartment. When he arrived, Petrovitz said that he really couldn't tell what was going on. He heard a scream and saw a shirtless man running away from him, but he couldn't tell what the situation was altogether. He said he didn't even see Tracey. Petrovitz did chase the half-naked man, though, by getting back in his car and driving down the driveway to the back of the apartment house. There he saw Buck holding a bloody knife, but said he still did not see Tracey. Petrovitz said he didn't immediately arrest Buck because he didn't know what had happened. He said, quote, "He could have stabbed a chicken. He could have stabbed a dog. I had no way of ascertaining that," unquote. It's testimony like this, designed to be a defense for Officer Petrovitz, that actually seems to prove Tracey's claim. Assuming that Petrovitz is being honest, the blatant disregard for Tracey's safety is unfurled and flying in the wind for all to see. Though Tracey was in fear for her life, the officer didn't bother to go quickly to her aid, and if he absolutely had to use the bathroom, he could have informed dispatch that he was not available to accept an urgent call. But he didn't. Once he was there, just seeing Buck holding a bloody knife should have been suspicious enough to detain Buck. After all, the officer was there because a woman was afraid for her life because of her husband's physical abuse. Even if it had been chicken blood or dog blood, that should have been enough for the officer to draw his gun and order Buck to put the knife down. Petrovitz said he couldn't do that because Buck was holding baby CJ by the time Petrovitz saw him. That timeline is suspicious, though, because Petrovitz admits seeing Buck running away from the front of the house, and we know that the stabbing happened immediately after they ran around the back of the house. After stabbing Tracey 13 times and stomping on her head, then Buck went into his apartment, retrieved CJ, and returned to stand over Tracey. This took time. It certainly took longer than the anticipated 20 to 30 seconds that it took the officer to drive about 100 yards. Unless the officer lollygagged, instead of speeding after Buck as he said he did, there's no way Buck had time to complete the assault, go into the house, grab the baby, and return back to Tracey, only to be seen by Petrovitz holding the baby and the bloody knife. Petrovitz testified that he still didn't see Tracey at this time, but he was close enough to Buck so that he could speak to him, and he talked Buck into handing him the knife. Once he had the knife, Petrovitz returned to his police car and locked it in the trunk. By that time, Petrovitz said there were so many people around that he didn't dare to do anything and risk hurting a bystander or the baby. So he just let Buck wander around. Eventually, Buck put the baby down, and Petrovitz said he saw his chance and jumped on Buck to take him down. Okay, well, here, I have to give some credit to the officer. I don't think I'd mention this, but Petrovitz was an older police officer, and he had already put in for his retirement about a month before the assault. So it was a little plucky for an older man to jump the 21-year-old Buck, who was shirtless and had just been holding a bloody knife. I'm not sure it was wise, but it shows some more commitment from Petrovitz than what we had seen to this point. Although Petrovitz claimed he still hadn't seen Tracey, I wonder if maybe he finally had, and this is what changed his behavior from being more passive to being more active. This is about the time that Tracey remembers Buck stomping on her head while throwing CJ down on top of her. If the officer witnessed that action, I think it would explain his sudden buy-in to tackling Buck. The police officer's report, however, does indicate that he saw Buck kick Tracey, as Petrovitz wrote on the day of the assault that Buck, quote, stomped on his wife's head, unquote. Memory is a funny thing, though, and we can't exactly trust either Tracey or Petrovitz's memories. Trauma can cause us to forget or mix up details. Even if Petrovitz saw Buck kick Tracey's head, it's possible that it was traumatic for him as well, and it could be something that he blocked from his memory over time. Despite Petrovitz's physical attempt to capture Buck, he didn't succeed as Buck wriggled away from the officer, and Petrovitz didn't see where he went. Petrovitz said he looked around a crowd, saw a man that he thought was Buck, and jumped on him, only to realize that he had captured the wrong man. When Petrovitz couldn't find Buck, he testified that he finally noticed Tracey. He and another officer picked up Tracey, took her over near a car, and propped her sitting up. Petrovitz said that her neck was limp at the time, but indicated that he didn't know that meant she had a neck injury. He also admitted that he didn't tell the ambulance paramedics about Tracey's head or neck injury. And again, this defense sounds like anything but a defense. It's more like the Keystone Cops, except there's nothing humorous as a woman lay bleeding out on the ground. Another police officer testified, Donald Kinniston, and he claimed that he had come to Tracey's house a number of times after she had called for help when Buck was threatening or menacing her. He said he asked her repeatedly if she wanted Buck arrested, and each time Tracey said no. When describing why he went to Tracey's home the first time, Kinniston said it was because there was an altercation between the Thurmans. I find this officer's word choice really interesting. His word choice indicates that he believed there was equal responsibility for this fight between Buck and Tracey. It wasn't about Buck attacking Tracey. It was about both of them fighting. When Tracey's lawyer pressed him about why he hadn't arrested Buck anyways, the officer said, quote, "If something transpires not in my presence, I need a complaint," unquote. It's an interesting claim, as Buck was breaking the law just by being at Tracey's, but the officer did not seem to view Buck as the aggressor, even though he knew the end result was that Buck almost killed Tracey. Side note, could this trial get any worse? We already have two police officers trying to defend themselves, but essentially they're bolstering Tracey's case that they didn't protect her. Well, yes, it could get worse. The former Captain Columbia testified that Tracey had filed an official complaint weeks before Buck's brutal assault, which is exactly what the police needed to arrest Buck. He said that Officer Storrs, who took the complaint, thought that another officer was handling the Thurman incident. Officer Storrs sent the case to the other officer, who was just leaving for vacation. The problem was, he didn't tell the other officer about the case. The former captain testified that the case just sat on a desk with no one taking any action because each officer thought the other one was handling it. Officer Storrs was also called to the stand, and he admitted that he was aware the other officer was going on vacation when he sent the file to him. So, Officer Storrs didn't think it was important enough for immediate action. He knowingly put Tracey's complaint on the back burner. Another cop, Officer Shop, testified that he took another one of Tracey's complaints at the police station, in which she reported Buck was threatening her and violating the conditions of his probation, which forbid him from seeking contact with Tracey. Shop said Tracey made the complaint but didn't want Buck arrested. When questioned, Shop couldn't say how he knew Tracey didn't want Buck arrested. He just knew. So he decided it was not a police matter and sent the case to the Family Relations Office instead. He also testified that he thought Tracey was only making the complaint to build a stronger case for a divorce. Tracey's original attorney, who had been working with her on the divorce, testified that he was convinced that Tracey was truly frightened of Buck. He did not believe the claims from the Torrington Police Department that Tracey was trying to falsely build a case against Buck. During the trial, the ambulance attendants who took Tracey to the hospital after Buck's assault also testified. They said that the police would not let them treat Tracey at the scene. Instead, the police foolishly blocked them and did things that may have exacerbated Tracey's injuries. One of the emergency technicians, Robert Choppy, indicated that the police were unhelpful at best, and at worst they risked injuring Tracey further. He said, quote, "The police didn't seem to know which way they were going," unquote. He said that when the police first called for an ambulance, they did not convey the urgency, and Tracey was not given priority for the emergency crew. Police had to call for an ambulance a second time because they hadn't indicated that there was a severe injury. During the second call, they finally disclosed that Tracey had been stabbed and was in bad shape. The ambulance crew testified to other problems, too. For instance, the police refused to let the emergency technicians give Tracey oxygen. The police also did not let the emergency personnel move Tracey onto the stretcher, even though they told the police to stop trying to move Tracey. Instead, according to the testimony of Tammy Bunnell, the other emergency tech, police, quote, kind of scooped her up and threw her on the stretcher. They weren't listening to us at all," unquote. She said the ambulance crew would have placed a cervical collar on Tracey first in order to immobilize her neck and head, and then scooted the stretcher under her so she was not lifted without full support. In the middle of the court trial, the chief of police for the City of Torrington, Anthony Neri, announced his retirement. This happened right around the time that Neri was called to testify in the trial, and he claimed that the police treated all complaints the same and that this case had been handled properly. Neri's claim was reinforced by the Deputy Chief Hayes, who agreed that the police had acted properly. A professor of economics also testified about Tracey's economic losses due to her injuries. Professor Crakes projected her loss was worth about $1 million. A professor of criminal justice at American University also testified as an expert. Professor Fife, who had been a police officer before moving into academia, said that police did not follow universal guidelines and should have arrested Buck at least 2 different times. Professor Fife also told the jury that it would have been inappropriate for police to have given Tracey the choice of whether or not to arrest Buck, because it's the police's job to make that decision. Tracey's lawyer rested the case, and it was time for the defense. Behind the scenes, there had been some negotiations going on. Tracey offered to settle the case for $1.3 million, which was a third of what she had been asking for in the lawsuit. The City of Torrington declined. They also declined to call any defense witnesses. Even though the city didn't call defense witnesses, the lawyer for the individual police officers did mount a defense. One of the major claims that the individual officers said is that they could not arrest Buck because Tracey had not asked them to do so. They argued that Tracey was in the midst of a divorce, and they perceived that she was just trying to manufacture evidence so that she could divorce Buck and get primary custody of their son CJ. On the stand, however, Torrington Police Sergeant John Rivers admitted that he was partly at fault that the police did not investigate the May 25th complaint that Tracey had filed against Buck. Officer Rivers admitted that he didn't do it. Officer Good was called to the stand to testify about the time he went out to Tracey's home 5 days before Buck's brutal assault. Good said that he and 2 other officers talked to Tracey that night and specifically asked her if she would like Buck arrested or if they should just tell him to stop bothering her. Good said, quote, "She said if we could find him, we should just warn him to stay away," unquote. Good said Tracey didn't know where Buck lived, so there was no way they could warn him off. When Tracey's lawyer asked him about his recollections and how well he remembered things from that night, Officer Good admitted that his memory of the night was poor and that he had not taken any notes that night about his interaction with Tracey. He was positive, however, that Tracey did not ask him to arrest Buck, or she would have needed to have come to the police station with him to file a complaint. While the officer doesn't outright say it, we can infer that he might not actually remember what Tracey said, but he's just assuming what she might have said based on her action or her inaction after he went to her apartment. So if she didn't go to the police station, she must not have wanted Buck to be arrested. Of course, this all ignores that Tracey had already gone to the police station, had already asked for her arrest, and Buck was already supposed to be in police custody. This makes quite a few officers who claimed Tracey specifically told them not to arrest Buck, and the officers believed it was because she was simply wanting her complaint on file while she was building a case for divorce. There is another notable witness for the defense who didn't end up helping them much either. The family relations caseworker testified that he had seen Buck accost Tracey outside of the agency building and had witnessed Buck smash her car windshield. He also said that his office could have sought a court hearing to determine that Buck had violated the conditions of his parole, but they didn't. When asked why the family relations office didn't do this, the caseworker simply said, quote, "I can't answer it," unquote. When pushed a little harder, he eventually speculated that it was his boss's job to do this, but that his boss had major health issues. The defense rested. Tracey was recalled to the stand as a rebuttal witness. She denied the officer's claims that she only wanted Buck warned and did not want him taken into custody. Tracey said, quote, "At all times I wanted him arrested," unquote. Behind the scenes, there were still sporadic settlement conferences, and Tracey's lawyer offered to settle the suit for $1 million. Judge Blumenfeld recommended that the City of Torrington should take the deal, but they decided to counteroffer for $700,000 instead, which Tracey rejected. After that, Judge Blumenfeld gave jury instructions as well as made one very important ruling. The judge announced that the jury could only consider compensatory damages, not punitive damages. That meant that the amount the jury could award would be less if they decided in Tracey's favor. It also meant that the police officers would not be held personally responsible if the jury decided they violated Tracey's 14th Amendment rights, or if the jury decided the officers were negligent. The City of Torrington would have to pay for them because it was a compensatory award. So at this point, the officers were able to put their houses back in their own names, as their property could no longer be seized if they lost the case. When giving jury instructions, the judge told the jurors that normally the police only have a general duty to protect people, and they do not have a duty to protect specific individuals. In this case, though, Connecticut law does require them to protect a specific individual if he or she were being threatened by an identifiable aggressor. If the police knew that Buck could cause harm to Tracey, then they were liable if they did not act in a reasonable manner to prevent it. While the judge was giving the jury instructions, the two different defense attorneys objected that he was biasing the jury. In particular, they didn't like the amount of detail the judge went into about the types of compensatory damages. They were also upset that the judge told the jury that they could make negative inferences that the city had not defended them against certain claims. If you remember, only the lawyer for the officers called witnesses, not the lawyer for the city. And in this case, the judge said that the jury could make some assumptions based on them not calling witnesses. Tracey's lawyer, however, said he had no problem with the jury instructions. The jury went off and deliberated for 2 hours and came back with their first decision. They had made a choice about whether or not the City of Torrington had violated Tracey Thurman's 14th Amendment rights. And I bet you think you know what they decided, right? They must have determined the city was guilty, right? No, they didn't. It took the jury just 2 hours to decide that the city was not guilty and that there was not a discriminatory policy that was biased against victims of domestic violence. Shocker, eh? It wasn't that surprising to Tracey, though, who simply told reporters, quote, "I'm a little disappointed," unquote. The soon-to-be retiring Chief of Police, Anthony Neri, said, quote, "It's a plus in our favor. I'm very happy about it," unquote. Tracey's lawyer had his eye on the long game, though. If you remember, he was partly inspired to take the case to try and prevent something like this from happening again, because he did not want his daughters growing up in a world where they could be assaulted and not protected. Weinstein said, quote, "Whatever happens, happens. But it was worth doing even if we lose. The City of Torrington will be more careful next time," unquote. Although the jury had decided in favor of the city, they still had to make a decision about the charges against the individual officers, which would still be the responsibility of the City of Torrington to pay, even though they had won the first part of the case. The jury deliberated for 8 hours over 2 days and returned with a decision. This time they found in favor of Tracey, saying that the 24 police officers did not do enough to protect her from the abuse of her husband, Buck. The police officers had violated her 14th Amendment rights by not giving her complaints the same attention they did to other cases that did not involve domestic violence. The retiring police chief, Anthony Neri, was among those found guilty. The jury awarded Tracey $2.3 million. They also awarded 3-year-old CJ $300,000. This was about $1 million less than what Tracey had originally asked for, but it was still a huge amount of money. Upon hearing the verdict, Tracey said, quote, "I am very glad it's over with. I am just really glad that the jury did believe me," unquote. She also told reporters that she hoped this ruling would help other women in situations similar to hers. Defense attorney Frankel was not happy with the decision and blamed the judge. He thought the whole case should have been dismissed early on, and Judge Blumenfeld opened a Pandora's box by allowing it to go forward in the first place. He also said the decision would have negative consequences for police in general. He said, quote, "The police will be afraid of being sued no matter what they do, if they arrest someone or if they don't. I don't think it's a position we should put anyone in," unquote. Whether or not Frankel liked it, the jury had decided, and the multi-million-dollar award for damages would need to be paid to Tracey, and it turned out it would be paid by the city's insurance carrier, Cigna. Tracey's lawyer was quote-unquote relieved and delighted by the verdict. He told the reporters, quote, "I kept my promise to Tracey that other women will be safe. Police will have to think twice before they ever act so irresponsibly again," unquote. A couple days later, the city filed one motion to request a new trial, another motion asking Judge Blumenfeld to overturn the verdict and the monetary award, and a third motion asking to delay paying the award until the previous motions had been settled. It took a couple months for the judge to rule, but when he did, he upheld the verdict and the award. He also ordered the city to put $3 million in an escrow account so that it would be accruing interest while the appeal was going on. In his decision, Judge Blumenfeld said, quote, "From this particularized pleading, a pattern emerges that evidences deliberate indifference on the part of the police department to the complaints of Tracey Thurman and its duty to protect her. Such an ongoing pattern of deliberate indifference raises an inference of custom or policy on the part of the municipality. Accordingly, the City of Torrington's motion to dismiss is denied," unquote. A few more months go by in which changes were a-comin' to Torrington. The mayor was on his way out while being investigated for corruption, and the soon-to-be retired police chief was also under investigation for corruption. The city reopened negotiations with Tracey while the appeal was pending. They offered to withdraw their appeal if Tracey accepted their new offer. Tracey was ready to put this behind her, and she agreed to settle for $1.975 million, which today most people just talk about as being a $2 million settlement. Tracey ended up taking home about $1.3 million, and CJ received $100,000, with the rest going to court costs and lawyer fees. Her lawyer was fully in favor of the settlement, and Weinstein said, quote, "Throughout my career, I tell my clients that the certainty you can live with is better than a risk that you cannot live with," unquote. With the $2 million offer, he said they had clearly reached the certainty that they could live with. At this point, we are closing in to the end of Tracey's story. We just have a few issues left to talk about, and the series Fight for Justice will be done. After it's completed, we'll take a short break while I'm prepping up the second part of Season 2, in which we're telling the story of Joshua Osborne and his siblings. Thanks so much for joining us at Targeted Podcast, True Crime, Domestic Violence. If you're interested in my sources or research, I include a bibliography on my website, www.targetedpodcast.com. If you're looking to connect with others who listen to the show, please consider joining our closed Facebook group called Targeted Podcast. You can tweet at me on Twitter. My handle is Targeted Podcast. Please stay tuned for promos at the end of the podcast and check them out if they sound interesting. I'll include links to them in my show notes. I'm Mo Blackwell, the host of Targeted. Peace, my friends. Peace.
We're not trying to change anybody's mind. We're just trying to understand it.
At We Too, we aim to explore gender differences in our current world. We want to hear stories, differing opinions, new ideas. We want to hear what you have to say, because you have a voice. And guess what? It matters.
Look for We Too Podcast, WETOO Podcast, on social media and on your favorite podcatchers.
Hey guys, do you like mysteries and urban legends?
Do you like creepy stories and unsolved true crime?
Then join us every Tuesday and Saturday at Mysteries and Urban Legends and get to the bottom of weird urban legends and spooky mysteries.